Let's talk about the HTML form tag. Form tags are extremely important to be aware of because we use them everywhere, right? So again, using the Facebook example, we need forms to log users into our web applications. We need them to sign up. We need them to pay money, right? E-commerce works out with forms. You enter your credit card data and whatnot. So forms are extremely important, and this is how we create forms in HTML. The first thing you'll need is an actual form tag. So we just write form, and it has a closing tag as well. And inside of this tag, that's where the actual form fields will go. So if I save this and refresh, you're not going to see anything until we have the actual form fields. Now I want to point something out. These tags typically have special attributes that we add to them. We'll add this action attribute, and we'll also add a method attribute. Okay, so let's explain this. The action attribute, what it does is you usually say something like this. You might send, it's the file that you're going to send this actual form data to. So when someone fills out a form, say here on Facebook, and they hit sign up, what it's going to do is send it to another file on the server. There's an actual file written in, maybe PHP or the Ruby programming language, some kind of a programming file, okay? And it'll have some kind of a special extension. And what that file will do is it'll be on alert for when form data comes to it. And when it does, it'll break each of these things down and say, okay, we've got a first name coming in. Let's maybe process it. Let's validate it, make sure that the email was proper. It'll go through and check all of the data and then maybe store it to a database. So it'll have some sort of a purpose, and that's what goes into this action attribute. So again, this is where we put the actual server file name that's going to handle the data from the form. Now, usually method, you'll either have a get in there or a post, and these are special HTML verbs, as we call them. We'll explore these down the line, but those are for actually carrying the data over to the server and how it kind of gets taken over there. So we've got these form fields here, form tags. We need the actual fields inside. So typically, the most common field you're going to see is the input. Okay, so the input looks like this. It's just an input tag. And now this is one of those self-closing tags, just like image and just like the line break tag. So it looks like this, and you can just have a trailing slash if you want. It doesn't necessarily need to be there. And if I save that, you'll see, there we go. We've got the default HTML form field. And now we can start having users type into that and send their data or whatever. So there are special attributes that can be assigned. There's this type attribute, and that's the main one you need to know about with input tags. And so by default, text is the default type, so you don't even have to add that. It's just going to look like this by default. But now, if you want a different type of form field, right, like the Facebook form here has got a drop down, it's got these radio buttons, as we call it, where you can select one or the other, and so on. That's where this type attribute comes into play. So we can do something like password. Now if I save that and refresh it, anything I type in here is going to be kind of blocked out so that nobody could be looking over my shoulder to see, the password I'm typing in. There's also, and we'll just add a few more fields down here. The other few ones that you just need to be aware of is the checkbox. So that allows us to actually put a check inside, right? Then there is the there is the radio, right? So that's where if we have multiple options and we want to select them, like we saw right here, those would be radio form fields. And then finally, the other most common one is the actual submit button. And the way we do that is we just do input type equals submit. Now if I save that, you'll see, there we go, we have a submit button. Now just keep in mind, again, we're not using any styles here. These don't look that fancy. We're going to use CSS to modify these form fields. We could have rounded kind of corners on this form field if we want. We could, make this submit button look larger and add color to it. So things like that are going to be handled with CSS. So that's a little bit about the main form fields. There's also a different type of form field other than the input, and it's called the text area. So we can do something like that. And you can add some special attributes to it. So let's just look at it by default first. And we need to make sure we close out the text area. This is not a self-closing tag. So if I refresh it, that's what a text area looks like by default. So it's for entering, larger chunks of text. And you can kind of control its default size a little bit if you want by adding this rows attribute, say 10, and this columns attribute is just COLS, say 20. If I refresh that, it's going to look a little different now. We can control how many rows it goes across and how many columns. So our rows would be down this way, columns would be to the right. So that's the text area. And then we've also got the drop-down menu, right? So we can do select, and we need a closing select tag. And then when I hit tab, I can add in some options. So these are the options that a user could have for drop-down. So you could say like male or female, right? If we wanted to do maybe like a gender drop-down. So now when I save it, we have this male-female kind of drop-down menu. And you can put as many options as you want into this section here. And then finally, one more very important aspect of forms is that you need these two attributes that you'll see when we're working with dynamic forms, when we're actually processing these forms and sending data to a server, right? So these forms right here, if I were to submit this, it's not going to go anywhere. We don't actually have an action for it to go to, right? We would need a server set up and then a Ruby file or a PHP file for that. So what you do need to be aware of when you are working with those files, and we'll see this down the line, is that you need to give your form fields a name. And that's important for when you're processing the actual form in the server. So that file where we give it the action, and we have that certain file, like whatever file we have that's going to process it. So say there's a Ruby file called processor. It's going to know which field we're talking about based on the names we give for each field. So we'll definitely need to have names attached to each of these when we're doing actual forms, whether it's a checkout form where you're taking credit card information or just a sign-up form. And then lastly, you can also have this value attribute. This is really helpful if you just want to pre-populate it with something. So if I just put something in there and I reset it, this one happens to be a password field. If I just change that to text, it'll drop in a default value. So that's really helpful if you want, some default values to be sitting there. That's what the value attribute does. And just a few last things to note. You'll notice that a lot of times forms aren't, kind of laid out horizontally like this. They're usually vertical. Like for example, here we're seeing these fields are mostly vertical all the way down. And one way to get around that is we could add paragraph tags and nest each input inside its own paragraph tag, like this. You could do the same for this one. And then by doing that, you'll start to see, okay, now they're starting to work vertically. And if I did that for all of the rest, you would see that. And one more thing is just that you'll have a label tag often associated with each tag, each input tag. And the reason why is because sometimes you're not going to see form fields just sitting out there like this. You may want a label to the left of it. So you could do something like this. And just for clarity, you'll say this is a label for this particular field. Let's give this field a name. We'll just say maybe car type. Let's say they're filling out a form about what kind of car they have. So for clarity, we add this for attribute here, and then we'll say car type field. And we'll say label. We need to close this. Now when I save it, There we go. That looks a little bit cleaner. And now our markup here, this HTML, has a little bit more organization and clarity. So that's a little bit about forms.